Imagine the first rays of dawn creeping over a limestone wall in Galilee. The air is cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and baking bread, but it also holds a sharper, more pungent truth. In the year 30 AD, there is no hum of pipes or rush of a flushing toilet to start your day. You step out onto a narrow dirt path where the dust from yesterday still clings to your sandals. Every morning, the struggle for basic human dignity begins anew in a landscape where water is more precious than gold. Here, the most private moments of your life are performed in the shadow of neighbors and under the weight of ancient laws. We often view the biblical world through a sanitized lens of marble temples and clean white robes. The reality was much louder, more crowded, and significantly more aromatic than we dare to imagine. To walk the paths Jesus walked is to navigate a world where the management of waste was a matter of spiritual survival. If you want to understand the raw, physical reality of the world that shaped the message of the Gospels, subscribe to this channel and join our growing community. By looking at the humble details of daily existence, we build a bridge to the people who first heard the teachings of Jesus. We promise that seeing the grit of the first century will make the spiritual truths shine even brighter. In the hills of Judea, your social status determined exactly how much of a struggle your morning would be. While Roman officials in Caesarea enjoyed stone benches over flowing water, the laborers of Nazareth lived with far more rudimentary solutions. This massive divide in comfort created a tension that influenced every social interaction Jesus ever had. Imagine the effort of carrying every drop of water for your family in a heavy clay jar from a distant well. When you only have 5 gallons for the entire day, you must choose between drinking, cooking, and washing. In this environment, sanitation was not just a convenience, it was a carefully calculated sacrifice of a life-giving resource. For the Jewish people, these physical challenges were deeply woven into a tapestry of religious obligation. The laws of purity transformed the act of relieving oneself into a series of rituals designed to keep the holy separate from the common. You were not just managing hygiene, you were navigating your standing before God and your neighbors. Archaeology reveals that most village homes had no dedicated space for nature callings. Instead, families shared 1 or 2 rooms where animals might even sleep nearby for warmth and security. When darkness fell, a simple pottery jar in the corner became the only solution for an entire extended household. As the sun rises higher, you might see a woman carrying a covered jar toward the edge of the village. She is not carrying water, but the waste of her household to a designated pit far from the living quarters. This was a daily walk of necessity performed with a quiet discipline that maintained the health of the entire community. This gritty reality was the exact world Jesus inhabited as he traveled from town to town with his disciples. He knew the heat of the pit, the smell of the street, and the humbling reality of physical existence in a world of scarcity. But how did these primitive conditions actually lead to the most revolutionary spiritual teachings in human history? The shadow of Rome was everywhere, but their luxury was a world away. While emperors in distant cities enjoyed fountains and stone sewers, the families of Galilee lived by the seasons and the mercy of the well. In Nazareth, the homes were built for survival rather than comfort. Thick walls of mud and stone trapped the heat of the day and the odors of the night, creating a close and heavy atmosphere where privacy was unknown. Access to clean water was the true dividing line between the powerful and the forgotten. A wealthy merchant might have a private cistern beneath his courtyard, but for the average worker, every cup of water was paid for in sweat and labor. Most of us use over 80 gallons of water today without thinking twice. In the year 30 AD, a family of 8 might survive on less than 5 gallons for everything from drinking and cooking to the most basic washing. This extreme scarcity meant that cleanliness was never a simple task. It was a constant and exhausting calculation. If you use too much to wash your face in the morning, would there be enough left for the evening stew or a thirsty child? The ancient laws of the people were very clear about the physical and spiritual danger of neglect. The Torah commanded that human waste be kept far from the living quarters and buried deep in the earth to protect the community. Imagine the village perimeter where simple pits were dug into the rocky soil. There were no stalls and no doors to provide cover, only the open sky and the shared understanding of a common human necessity that could not be ignored. Privacy, as we know it today, did not exist in the first century world. Your neighbors knew exactly when you left for the fields and when you visited the edge of town, making every intimate action a part of the public record. These natural functions were not just messy, they were ritually significant in the eyes of the law. The state of your body dictated whether you could enter the synagogue or join the community for a festive meal. Into this world of rigid rules and harsh physical limits, Jesus brought a message that would eventually turn these systems upside down. But first, he had to live within them, sharing the same dust and the same humble facilities as the men and women he came to save. The shadow of Rome was everywhere, but their luxury was a world away. While emperors in distant cities enjoyed fountains and stone sewers, the families of Galilee lived by the seasons and the mercy of the well. In Nazareth, the homes were built for survival rather than comfort. Thick walls of mud and stone trapped the heat of the day and the odors of the night, creating a close and heavy atmosphere where privacy was unknown. Access to clean water was the true dividing line between the powerful and the forgotten. A wealthy merchant might have a private cistern beneath his courtyard, but for the average worker, every cup of water was paid for in sweat and labor. Most of us use over 80 gallons of water today without thinking twice. In the year 30 AD, a family of 8 might survive on less than 5 gallons for everything from drinking and cooking to the most basic washing. This extreme scarcity meant that cleanliness was never a simple task. It was a constant and exhausting calculation. If you used too much to wash your face in the morning, would there be enough left for the evening stew or a thirsty child? The ancient laws of the people were very clear about the physical and spiritual danger of neglect. The Torah commanded that human waste be kept far from the living quarters and buried deep in the earth to protect the community. Imagine the village perimeter where simple pits were dug into the rocky soil. There were no stalls and no doors to provide cover, only the open sky and the shared understanding of a common human necessity that could not be ignored. Privacy, as we know it today, did not exist in the first century world. Your neighbors knew exactly when you left for the fields and when you visited the edge of town, making every intimate action a part of the public record. These natural functions were not just messy, they were ritually significant in the eyes of the law. The state of your body dictated whether you could enter the synagogue or join the community for a festive meal. Into this world of rigid rules and harsh physical limits, Jesus brought a message that would eventually turn these systems upside down. But first, he had to live within them, sharing the same dust and the same humble facilities as the men and women he came to save. Would you like me to continue with segments 21 to 30? To understand the ancient mind, we must recognize that a dirty body was more than an inconvenience. It was a spiritual barrier. In the year 30 AD, certain bodily functions were seen as a source of ritual impurity that temporarily separated a person from the holy spaces of their community. This was not a judgment on the character of a person or a label of sin. It was a recognition of the fragility of life. Every visit to the edge of town or every natural cycle of the body was a reminder that humans are made of dust and must constantly seek a return to the sacred. Without the luxury of soft paper, the people of the first century turned to the earth for their most basic needs. Archaeological digs have uncovered small, smooth stones and broken pieces of pottery that were once used for hygiene. These humble objects tell a story of a people who were forced to be incredibly resourceful with the scraps of their world. This practical reality dictated a strict social code that is still visible in many cultures today. Because water was too scarce for deep scrubbing, the left hand was strictly reserved for the most private acts of cleaning. The right hand was kept pure for eating, for greeting friends, and for touching the holy scrolls of the law. While the Roman Empire was famous for its grand public latrines, most Jewish families viewed these places with a mixture of awe and horror. In a Roman city, you might sit on a stone bench beside 20 strangers with no walls to hide you. This lack of privacy was a direct assault on the deep Jewish value of modesty and personal dignity. To the Roman mind, the bathroom was a place of social gathering and political gossip. But for the followers of the law, the act of relief was something to be done in quiet isolation, far from the eyes of others. This cultural clash made the Roman cities feel like a foreign and spiritually dangerous world. Imagine the physical toll of a Galilean winter when the rains turned the paths into thick mud and the winds bit through thin woolen tunics. A trip to the village perimeter at night was not just uncomfortable, it was a dangerous journey into the cold and the dark. These were the moments when the grit of human life was felt most acutely. In the heat of the summer, the challenges changed but remained just as relentless. The stagnant pits at the edge of the village attracted swarms of flies and carried the constant threat of sickness to the crowded homes. In a world without modern medicine, maintaining a clear boundary between waste and water was the only shield against a deadly outbreak. Every morning, the ritual of hand-washing offered a brief moment of reclamation. By pouring water over the fingers before a meal, the worker could shed the grime of the fields and prepare to receive the daily bread as a gift from God. This small act turned a physical necessity into a profound statement of faith. But what happens when these rules of washing become a weapon used to exclude the poor and the marginalized? This was the question that began to boil in the hearts of those who lived on the edges of society. They were waiting for a voice that could speak to their reality and offer a different kind of purity. At the heart of every settlement stood the communal well, the pulse of the village. For the women and children, the day began with the weight of empty jars pulling at their shoulders. This was not a quick chore, but a grueling trek through the rising heat to secure the lifeblood of the household. You can hear the rhythmic splash of the bucket and the murmur of voices as news is traded in the cool of the dawn. Every cup of water carried back was a testament to the endurance of the family. In this world, the woman who managed the water held the keys to the health and survival of everyone under her roof. Because water was so rare, the community developed an unspoken language of conservation. You would wash your hands over a basin so that the runoff could be caught and used again to water a parched plant or dampen the dust of the floor. Nothing was ever truly discarded until it had served every possible purpose. Think back to that woman seen at daybreak walking toward the outskirts with a covered clay jar. This was the household duty of removing the waste from the pots used while the family slept. It was a humble, silent task that kept the cramped living quarters from becoming a breeding ground for disease. The jar she carried was not just a container of filth, but a vessel of community responsibility. By taking it far beyond the stone walls of the village, she was fulfilling an ancient mandate to keep the camp holy and clean. This routine was a vital part of the daily rhythm, performed with a dignity that modern eyes often overlook. Once the jar was emptied, it would be scrubbed with sand and ash, the only abrasives available to the common person. There were no chemical cleaners, only the friction of the earth and the heat of the sun to purify the tools of daily life. Even these lowly vessels were treated with a discipline that bridged the gap between the mundane and the sacred. For those living in the shadows of society, like the homeless or the diseased, the system offered no mercy. A man like Lazarus, lying at a gate with open sores, had no access to these rituals or these precious jars of water. His lack of hygiene was not a choice, but a visible mark of his total exclusion from the community of the pure. The religious elite often viewed such people as walking sources of defilement. To even pass too close to one who could not manage their own cleanliness was to risk a spiritual contagion. This created a world where the most vulnerable were not only physically suffering, but were religiously invisible and socially abandoned. This is the exact environment where Jesus chose to walk and teach. He did not stay in the sanitized courtyards of the high priests or the marble villas of the governors. Instead, he spent his days in the dust of the marketplaces and the crowded rooms of the poor, where the reality of the human body was impossible to ignore. By entering into the heat and the grime of the common life, he was making a radical statement about the nature of God. He was showing that the divine was not afraid of the messy parts of human existence. But how would his presence change the way these people viewed their own worth in a world that judged them by their skin? Even in a world of dust and manual labor, the desire for a clean face was a matter of basic dignity. Without modern soap, people turned to the land for cleansing agents. They used the crushed leaves of the soapwort plant or the alkaline ash from wood fires to cut through the oils and sweat of a long day in the sun. Your smile was maintained with equal resourcefulness using the tools provided by nature. People did not have plastic brushes, but they used the frayed ends of aromatic twigs to scrub their teeth. They chewed on fresh mint or anise to sweeten the breath, using the very plants that would later become a focal point of debates about religious taxes and priorities. In the absence of daily showers, the scent of a person was a mixture of wood smoke, livestock, and hard work. To manage this, those who could afford it applied olive oil infused with the fragrance of local herbs like myrrh or frankincense. These oils acted as a second skin, moisturizing against the dry heat, while masking the persistent odors of a crowded village. For a more thorough cleaning, the people of Galilee looked to the waters of the sea or the flow of the Jordan River. Bathing in these natural sources was a communal event, yet it was strictly governed by a sense of deep modesty. You would wash while partially clothed, always mindful of the eyes of the community and the boundary between the private body and the public world. This balance of physical care and religious duty was about to be tested by a new teacher from Nazareth. A controversy erupted when the followers of Jesus were seen eating their bread without first performing the ritual washing of their hands. To the casual observer today, this might seem like a simple lapse in hygiene, but to the people of 30 AD, it was a spiritual earthquake. The religious leaders were not concerned with the germs on the skin, but with the tradition of the elders. They believed that the world was full of invisible defilement that could be transferred from the hands to the soul through the act of eating. For them, the ceremonial pouring of water was a vital shield that kept the darkness of the world at bay. Jesus met this rigid tradition with a perspective that must have felt like a cool breeze in a stifling room. He taught that nothing entering a person from the outside could truly defile them. He insisted that the real source of uncleanness was not found in the dust of the marketplace or the lack of a ritual wash, but in the hidden intentions of the human heart. Imagine the shock of the crowd as they heard these words. They were a people who spent their lives hauling water and scrubbing jars to maintain a standard of purity that often felt out of reach. Suddenly, they were being told that the heavy burden of external rituals was secondary to the condition of their inner lives. This message was a lifeline to those who lived on the margins of society. The fishermen with scales under their fingernails and the laborers with stained tunics were being told they were not far from God. Jesus was peeling back the layers of religious performance to reveal a faith that was accessible to everyone regardless of their access to a basin of water. But to truly understand the depth of this shift, we must look at the most vulnerable part of the ancient body, the feet. Exposed to the elements and the waste of the streets, the feet were a constant witness to the grime of the world. As we move toward the final days of this story, a simple basin of water is about to become a symbol of a revolution in service and love. In a stinging critique that resonated with every household laborer, Jesus compared religious hypocrisy to a cup that is scrubbed on the outside while the inside remains full of rot. To a people who spent their lives scouring porous clay dishes with handfuls of sand and precious drops of water, this was a vivid and biting metaphor. Imagine the wasted effort of a servant who presents a shining bowl that still contains the dregs of yesterday's decay. Jesus used this common kitchen frustration to expose the way we often curate our public images, while the private corners of our hearts remain neglected. He was teaching that a truly clean vessel is defined by what it holds, not just how it reflects the light. This was the final collision between a system of external performance and a message of internal transformation. The religious elite had spent centuries building a wall of rituals to keep the world's filth at bay, but Jesus was showing them that the wall was built on a foundation of pride. He was calling for a purity that did not fear the dust, but instead sought to heal the heart from within. Even the act of baptism, as performed by John and later the disciples, was a radical departure from the repeated ritual washings of the day. It was not a temporary fix for a daily problem, but a single definitive immersion that signaled a new life. The water was no longer just a tool for hygiene, but a threshold into a kingdom where the soul is washed once and for all. As we look back through the centuries, we see that the people of 30 AD were not so different from us. We have replaced the clay chamber pot with porcelain and the dusty path with pavement, but the struggle for human dignity remains the same. We still face the temptation to clean the outside of our lives while hoping no one sees the shadows we carry inside. The gritty reality of the world Jesus inhabited reminds us that the divine is not found in a sterile laboratory or a secluded palace. The incarnation was a deep dive into the raw sensory experience of heat thirst and the very real odors of a crowded human life. It is a powerful reminder that God is most present exactly where we feel most vulnerable and unpolished. When we hear the promise of living water today, we should remember the woman at the well who knew the exact weight of a water jar in the midday sun. To her, this was not a poetic idea, but a desperate hope for a life where her worth was not defined by her labor or her past. It shows that faith is most potent when it meets us in our most practical bodily needs. The dust and the scarcity of the first century do not diminish the beauty of the gospel. They are the very things that give it weight. It is one thing to speak of love in a world of comfort, but it is another to live it out in a place where every drop of water is a sacrifice. The harsh environment of ancient Judea proves that the most profound truths are often forged in the least comfortable places. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from this ancient world is the value of mindfulness in the small things. In a world without faucets, every washing of the hands was a deliberate act of gratitude for the resources provided by the earth. By rediscovering the physical struggle of their daily lives, we can find a fresh appreciation for the common graces we so easily ignore. The paths of Galilee are still dusty and the heat of the sun has not changed, but the message spoken in that world continues to challenge our own. If seeing the raw, unwashed reality of the first century has changed how you hear the words of Jesus, please share your thoughts with us in the comments. We thank you for joining us on this journey into the tangible heart of history, where the most humble moments of life reveal the greatest truths of all.